Thank you very much and welcome, Minister Nadia Calviño. Before we have the pleasure to talk, we have a short video in which our Madrid correspondent, Sandra Leuven, explained what, in her view, are the 3 core challenges for Spain in this year. So please, could we see this video?
Spain is the country who has suffered the worst recession last year among the advanced economies. The decline was double-digit, -11%. Spain is also a country who had imbalances even before the outbreak of the pandemic, like a very volatile labor market. The biggest challenges, therefore, are first, to contain the spread of the virus, which continues to hit Spain particularly hard, and to speed up vaccination. Second, the government has to make sure it uses the money from the EU Recovery Fund in an effective way to stimulate growth and to put in place the necessary reforms to tackle the existing imbalances. The opportunity is clearly there. Spain is set to receive the biggest chunk of EU money after Italy. Last but not least, among foreign investors, Madrid would certainly create confidence if it laid out a plan on how it wants to reduce the high debts that the country is accumulating during this pandemic.
The challenges for 2021. Welcome, Nadia Calviño in Madrid. Let's talk about sustainable growth in Spain first before we come to the EU perspective. 11% decrease in GDP last year, though the fourth quarter looked promising with a slight tiny growth, but not sustainable. When do you think Spain will be back to sustainable growth, and how do you want to manage to get back there?
Yes, well, first of all, thank you very much for the invitation. Also, thank you very much to Sandra for her summary of the key challenges ahead. I have a couple of comments I will add in a moment, but it is a great pleasure to be able to share some thoughts with you on the top priorities at national and European level for 2021. Now, I think that for the past almost 12 months, our economy, also in Germany and throughout the whole world, actually, our economy has been marked by the crisis, and we need to make 2021 the year of the recovery. Now, what we have seen in the Spanish economy was a very sharp drop in GDP in the second quarter of 2020, due to the higher weight of those sectors that were hit hardest because of the cut of mobility. I'm talking about obviously tourism, but the care sector, all that has to do with interpersonal relations. But we also saw a very strong recovery in the summer. And as you indicated, the positive trend was also maintained in the fourth quarter. And we think that this signals, first of all, that the Spanish economy is quite flexible and resilient, as has been shown in previous crises. Secondly, that the second and third waves have had a smaller impact than the first one in the spring. That's quite clear, because in the summer last year, we didn't have international tourism, and the second wave of the pandemic was already hitting important powerhouses of Spain. And thirdly, that the measures that we put in place since last March have been effective to protect the economic tissue, to protect jobs and family income. And this is the basis on which we have to build the recovery in the course of 2021. So actually our priorities this year are first and foremost to fight the pandemic. I think that we have a shared priority across the world, and accelerate vaccination. Secondly, to continue protecting the economic tissue and jobs so that we do not lose what we have protected until now. We still have some weeks and months ahead which are going to be tough on the health and economic front and social front. So we need to continue adjusting our measures to ensure that they are effective. Thirdly, as Sandra was indicating, to be as fast and as efficient as possible in implementing the recovery plan, which is instrumental to avoid the drop in investment, which is characteristic of previous pandemics, and which would be a serious hindrance to the recovery in our country. So these are our priorities. We have been working very, very hard for the last year, and we continue to be working hard with a view to ensuring that we have a smooth recovery, and that Spain can be, as has been in the past, one of the motors of the recovery in Europe.
So, and time-wise, you think that the summer will be the time for the turnaround when tourism can perhaps in some form start again, and the recovery fund means money starts to kick in? Or when do you think we will see the turnaround?
Well, as you rightly point out, the key element for the turnaround or for the change of trend is definitely the vaccination and the health front. And we all have a shared interest to ensure that at national level our vaccination goes as smoothly as possible. The news we have from those countries that are most advanced, like Israel, is positive, that the vaccine is really putting an end to the pandemic. And that, I think, is giving us a lot of hope and a light at the end of the tunnel, that if we persevere with a strong and smooth vaccination process, we will see the end of the pandemic soon. No? So that's the first element of uncertainty, but also a key driver. A second element is we need to ensure that this happens not only at national level, we need to ensure that that happens at European level. These are our key markets for tourism and for exports for Spain. And obviously at global level, we need to ensure that people recover confidence throughout the world. So that's a second challenge. And I think in the meantime, we need to continue to work on standardizing passports, vaccination certificates, so that people are confident and we can recover international transportation and tourism in a safe manner also as soon as possible. With all these ifs and buts, the general perspective and all forecasts agree that the second part of the year should witness strong growth in the Spanish economy. But of course, the faster that we can deploy vaccination, well, the sooner this turnaround will be visible. And I hope we can keep the positive trend that we preserved since last summer, also in the first quarter of the year, so that we can, have this strong basis for the recovery I was referring to a moment ago.
As you mentioned, tourism is a major economic pillar of the Spanish economy. Do you see this summer season with international tourists being part of the summer season in Spain?
Well, it's as I was saying a moment ago. It's very difficult to make 100% or even 80% sure predictions in this area, because there are uncertainties which are not dependent on economic policy. But indeed, I would hope that by the summer we will have a tourism season. I also think it's very important, and as I was saying a moment ago, that we continue to be effective in protecting the tourism sector, and that we profit from this relative hibernation process to upgrade the tourism sector in Spain, to make it more sustainable, more green, more digital, so that actually in a year's time, we're going to see that our tourism industry, which is one of the strongest in Europe, is just as competitive as it was until now, or if not more.
This morning I spoke with the Greek Prime Minister Mitsotakis, and he said that he thinks that there should be a European scheme, a common scheme on vaccination passports or certificates and privileges for tourists being vaccinated already. Is that also your view, and when do you think we would need such passports?
I think we should work as fast as possible in having this harmonized passport system, not only at European level. As I mentioned a moment ago, Spain is also driving this forward in the OECD and other international fora, because we need to be as united as possible in fighting the pandemic from every point of view. I think that acting together as one at the 27 member states and having a single voice in Europe has been instrumental for the negotiations with the big pharmaceutical companies for the vaccines. I think that the strong European response on the economic front has been absolutely key to ensure that we have been able to protect this economic basis, and that this crisis is not comparable to previous crises in terms of economic tissue and job destruction. And this is very important for the recovery, obviously. And likewise, I think we should be as united as possible when discussing how are we going to recover this safe mobility throughout the EU and beyond.
even at a moment when not everyone is capable of getting a vaccine?
I didn't. I have only referred to having harmonized criteria. I wouldn't like to, prejudge what exactly should be the criteria to be used for this mobility. I just think that we need to work together. We cannot let each country act on their own, because then we won't have the confidence of citizens when they are deciding on moving around and having their vacation, which I am quite sure all of us are really looking forward to after this very tough year that we are leaving behind.
You mentioned the European effectiveness in creating the Recovery and Resilience Fund. Could you give us an example of one flagship project, perhaps where you say, okay, this is a good example on how Spain wants to use and invest the money from the Recovery Fund?
Yes, I think we shouldn't only refer to the Recovery Fund as a good example of the European response to the crisis. I think that conversely to previous crises, this time around, we have acted in a coordinated manner, the 27 member states, particularly in the Eurogroup, but generally the 27. We have coordinated our fiscal policies. Monetary policy has gone in the right direction to preserve financial stability. The ECB is key in this regard. And we have established already last spring a number of safeguards and safety nets, which are also very important as a message to citizens that the European Union is really thinking about them. For example, in the case of Spain, we have borrowed 21 billion euros from the EU for funding our short-term work schemes, like the Kurzarbeit mechanisms in Germany.
With the SURE program, yes.
Indeed, with the SURE program. And these has been, it's not only the financing part, the fact that we can save some money, in terms of the cost. It's a very important message to Spanish citizens that Europe is not only saving banks or companies, it's saving workers and jobs, and this instrument, which has been used for the first time in Spain, has meant that this crisis has been completely different to the previous crisis. The numbers show that we have been able to preserve jobs, that these instruments have been very efficient in getting people back to work. So in Spain, we had at the height in last spring 3.4 million workers covered, and we are now around 700,000. And the number is stable in the second and third wave, which shows that these mechanisms have been extremely efficient to avoid the normal vicious circle of previous crises in Spain, where a little drop in activity leads to very sharp drops in employment, and therefore a vicious circle, in terms of. So this time around, Europe has provided a safety net, which has been key. And the Recovery Fund is the key instrument for all of us to invest, to borrow together, to invest together in our future, And we have been working very hard in the Spanish Recovery Plan with 4 key political priorities: green, digital, social and territorial cohesion, and closing the gender gap. And we are working on a plan. We have already advanced a lot in our informal dialogue with investments and reforms, which are very much focusing on green and digital. We have a digital agenda, which is public. We have already published 6 detailed investment plans, which the sector and experts are praising as very good and serious plans. In the green area, we're moving ahead with reforms. We are one of the leading countries in Europe in this green transformation. So we have detailed 30 components with investments and reforms, so that in the coming 2-3 years, we can not only kickstart strong growth and job creation, but also start transforming our economic model with a view to making it more sustainable in the mid to long run too.
We have one voice from our audience, Minister Calviño. It's from Gabriele Sorg from Mallorca. And she says the situation, especially in Mallorca, but on the Balearic Islands, is dramatic. More than 300,000 people are going into poverty. The local government has a lot of problems. It's not transparent, and the money doesn't reach the people who need it. How can you help?
Well, I mean, the description is quite accurate in the sense that when we have looked at the different regional impact of the pandemic, the two most hit economies in regions in Spain are obviously those that are more dependent on tourism, and that is the Balearic Islands and the Canary Islands. And that is why from the beginning we have invested a lot of money and effort in supporting the firms and jobs in these areas. We have invested more than 40 billion euros in direct aid in terms of support to self-employed workers, also the short-term work schemes, also other support measures for companies. We have also reinforced the social security system and mechanisms, which are primarily the responsibility of the regional authorities or the local authorities. But I fully see that, and I said at the beginning, I think the coming weeks and months are still going to be extremely challenging. And we are exploring all possible options on how to reinforce the solvency of companies and how to reinforce all those mechanisms and transfer resources to the regions so that they can be as efficient as possible in supporting the social tissue. We should really focus also on the young and women, because these are the two groups within our societies which are most directly hit by the pandemic, on the health front, on the care sector front, on the tourism sector front, in terms of the vulnerability of their employment. And we really should focus our effort in those groups of people and the most vulnerable, so that we do not have an even larger inequality in Spain, as we have been suffering for the last 10 years.
Before you became Minister of Economy in Spain, you have been Director General for Budget of the European Commission. Now, if we talk about the European Recovery and Resilience Fund, there will be the refinancing. Is this the start of Eurobonds in the European Union, or is it just an emergency instrument which will stop after a few years, and there won't be any discussion about common refinancing of the European Union member states?
Well, generally, I think that there is a common view throughout Europe, or in particular in the Eurozone, that we need to reinforce the international role of the euro, throughout the world. That is also an element of strategic autonomy of the Union. And I think in Germany, the euro is perceived as an element of strength of Europe, and likewise in Spain. So we all have to see how to make the euro a valuable asset and strengthen the role throughout the world. And from this point of view, obviously, the more that there are bonds which are issued at European level, be it by the Commission, but also the European Investment Bank, also the European Stability Mechanism. So there are different bonds which are being issued, and that, I think, is an opportunity. Likewise with the issuance of green bonds. If we manage to have a green standard throughout the world, and I think Europe can actually lead in the area of the green transition, that also is going to give us a stronger role when this becomes the norm throughout the world, as I hope will be in the coming years. Having said that, I think that first we have to make this recovery fund a success, and that is our top priority right now. It's a bit premature to start saying what this is going to be in some years' time, when we haven't yet finished the formal adoption process, when we haven't approved the national plans. We are really focused right now in making this a success for Spain and for Europe as a whole. And then we will be able to take decisions going forward, for the next multi-annual financial framework, but that's after 2027. So.
As our title is Europe on the eve of a new era, when you think about Europe being a major third force in the global world order next to the US and China, what additional steps, reforms, etc., would you have in mind as necessary for the European Union?
Well, it's a very good question. It's also a very challenging question, because there are many different elements that make us strong on the world arena. Once Europe, I think, has decided that we are not going to be a strong power based on military power. which doesn't mean that we don't need to reinforce our autonomy on that front, which I think is one of the priorities, that the EU is working on. But once we're on that front, we really should continue to be a strong economic power based also on our values, on our priorities, our rights, the European model, the social economy model, which I think makes us the beacon for the rest of the world. This element should, I think, impinge on all our policies, be it development policies, be it also the role of the euro in the world, be it our participation in different multilateral fora. And from this point of view, I think that there are two elements, I have already mentioned them, which can be quite specific of Europe and which we have to make strength, one of our strengths, going forward. I think the digitalization process, ensuring that this digitalization process is putting citizens at the center, that we ensure that the digitalization process protects the rights, the values of citizens, and that can make it a different process to other parts of the world. And also ensuring that there is a level playing field and a fair competition framework for companies also throughout the world. That's one element. And then the second one is the green transition. Let's see what the new US administration, the direction they're taking. Obviously, that's much more encouraging than the past. But anyway, Europe is at the forefront of the green transition. And that, I think, is one of our strengths. We're going to be investing in the coming years in an area where the returns are they're exponential. If we mobilize public investment and private investment for this green transition, we develop the technologies of the future, we ensure a better quality of life and a new way to run our economies, a more sustainable circular economies, etc. That can provide to be a competitive advantage on the economic front and on the political front on the world level. And I think that's a quite integrated feature in all our countries. And by acting together, there's also a multiplying effect that we should not neglect.
If we talk about acting together on the one field you mentioned, digitalization, wouldn't it have been wise that all the 27 member states of the European Union found one strategy how to implement Huawei technology in their 5G networks?
Well, indeed, one would have hoped that we could have had a totally agreed piece of legislation. Still, I think that the toolbox adopted by the European institutions provides us with a clear framework where we have to make our decisions at national level. It is also true that security is an area which is still reserved, to the nations to rule, and therefore the competences at European level probably didn't go far enough to totally harmonize this. But at the end of the day, all of us are finding our way, and the approach is going to be quite, at the end of the day, probably quite similar in the different countries. Insofar as Spain is concerned, we have launched the public consultation on how we're going to translate this toolbox into our national legislation. And the approach we're taking in this consultation, we will see the replies in order to make the final decision. But the approach we've taken is quite similar to the one in Germany, in the sense of not excluding ex ante an individual or specific player, but giving us the tools necessary to ensure security and integrity in this 5G world. Actually, for us, the deployment of 5G is a top priority in our digital agenda, because Spain is a European country which has the widest broadband network. Actually, broadband deployed in Spain is more than the addition of France, Germany, Italy, and the UK, and thanks to the investments of the past 20 years. And that provides us with a very strong infrastructure for the deployment of 5G. One of our priorities in the coming 3 years is going to be the deployment of 5G. And we need to, of course, ensure that there is an appropriate protection of the safety and the rights of citizens in our countries, and so we need to find the right framework for doing so. And my impression is that we're quite aligned with the German approach, and probably all member states are going to be more or less around the same principles. So I hope that we will be able to have a good framework for, as I was saying, the European digitalization model.
Right. You mentioned the European Central Bank as being a crucial player in the recovery year we have now. A question from the audience from Thomas Moses. How do you see the role of the European Investment Bank as a tool to fight the pandemic and its economic consequences?
Well, indeed, we think that the European Central Bank has been, is, and will continue to be instrumental to provide us with the financial stability that we need to be able to fight this pandemic. But the European Investment Bank is a very important player. I mean, it does have a very strong role in Spain. I think that Spain is the country, the first client, if I may call it this way, of the European Investment Bank. Not so much on the public sector, but on the private sector. And therefore, I am sure that the reinforcement that we have agreed of the EIB is also going to be an important tool. But credit is not enough, because companies are going to be more indebted as a result of this pandemic. We have used too many instruments to provide liquidity to the industry, but that is going to increase the leverage of companies, not the indebtedness of the private sector. And so we need to make sure that, or that's why it's so important to have the recovery fund from the EU also having transfers that would allow us to undertake these investments without overburdening already the high debt ratios in our countries. If I may, before we finish, I connect here with the first question that was posed, which was about the debt ratios and the public debt ratios, because actually, it's a pity. We were on the right track and then the pandemic hit us. I hope that as soon as possible, we're able to resume the downward path of the debt to GDP ratio. It's true that Spain is not amongst the highest indebted European countries, but
still,
obviously
it's 114% of the GDP, right? So there is
we expect it to reach to around 119% as a result of the pandemic. It's obviously that there's a jump in every country right now, and we have needed to issue the debt in order to fund the reinforcement of our health sector and the education sector and all these response to the pandemic. Okay, but what we hope is if we manage to have strong growth this year, in the second part of the year, which is, as I said before, our forecast right now, we would already start stabilizing our debt to GDP ratios and our deficit to GDP ratios, reducing them in 2021, and try to see if we are able to resume a path of strong, sustainable growth, which also allows us to resume the path of a reduction of these fiscal imbalances, which certainly are going to be a characteristic in all countries throughout the world as a result of the pandemic.
We have more than 150% debt to GDP ratio in Italy, more than 200% in Greece. Do you think this is sustainable and can be reduced without having a haircut debt release discussion in a few years?
I think it's absolutely premature to have this discussion. Right now, we have stable financial markets which are providing us with the necessary framework to undertake these decisions. In the short run, the focus should be on growth, resuming growth. This is what international investors are looking for in Europe. This is what financial markets are telling us. The priority should be for our countries to resume strong growth as soon as possible. And then we will see, what the outlook is for 2022 in order to determine the right fiscal stance and take it from there. I think it is... Also, we have to change our mindset in the sense that the scenarios and the analysis that were done in the past are somewhat not corresponding to the reality we're living in now, where interest rates are zero or even negative for so long. And this requires us to revisit our approach in terms of long-term sustainability. Actually, for example, in the case of Spain, last year, our sustainability ratios have improved because the cost of the service of the debt has gone below 2% of GDP, which is, it is going in the right direction. We're able to reduce our interest rates, to extend the maturity. So what we see is that probably these are issues which need to be revisited and looked at from a different perspective going forward.
Thank you very much, Nadia Calviño. It was a pleasure to have you here with us.
Likewise, vielen Dank. And I wish you excellent health to all of you.